in settling Texas. And she got so interested in them, and some of them were written beautifully because they had had a nice education, and some of them were so uh, terribly colloquial, full of colloquialism that she had to put them into paragraphs and try to put periods and everything so she could make some sense of them. But she has included those journals in this book. It really is a collection, 16 tales of women and their husbands and their families and what they went through to settle Texas. It's hard to imagine that 170 years ago there was not a state of Texas. There was a Republic of Mexico here, which had superseded Spain, superseded Spain and France. And they now had control of Texas. And they discouraged any white people, any Anglos, coming in to settle Texas at all. And in fact, they had refused to let them come in. They had tried to encourage their own people to come north and settle Texas. And they would come as far as San Antonio. San Antonio, as you know, was the first inhabited settlement in Texas. And the Spaniards settled that one way back in the 1400s. In fact, the first mission in San Antonio is in 1452, something like that. And they have 4 missions. And by this time that our story takes place, 170 years ago, San Antonio was a thriving Mexican municipality. And it had 4 missions and 8 schools. And it was but it still had many Indian raids. And the Mexican people hated the Indians so because they came down into Mexico and swept through small towns and captured the children and the women and killed the men and went back north again through Texas back up into Colorado and North Dakota and Canada, where they had come from. They came in there and to get their slaves, and that's the way the Mexican people had lived in slavery for years to the marauding Texans. There was a visionary man named Moses Austin who had been applying to the Mexican government for years to see if they would allow any settlements, any colonists to come to Texas. Because the United States was getting crowded. Now that seems foolish since there wasn't anything west of the Mississippi much. But it was getting crowded where they were because the people clung to the old European style of handing down their farms and their homesteads to the eldest son. And they had large families, so the next 5 or 6 sons had to go somewhere else to find property and land to settle on and build up their own little empire. And so they had moved as far west as they had been moving. Their scouts had been telling about the beautiful land where they could grow cotton. And a lot of the cotton farmers were very impressed with the fact that there was fertile loam river bottoms where they could plant their cotton. And that while most of the Texas was a big desert, the East Texas part and the Bay Area was very inducive to their way of life. So they wanted to come in. Now, Moses Austin is not just a household word you just toss around. Jill, have you learned anything about the Austins?
Yeah, his son had to carry out his mission because he died before he could ever do it.
You are so well informed. Thank you. Moses was Stephen F. Austin's father. Stephen F. Austin also planned with his father to get this. Moses Austin made the first approaches and got the first permission to bring in colonists. But before he could get his colonists all gathered, and I'm so glad you're learning this because I was afraid that Texas history had gone the way that a lot of things that I grew up with had gone the way of. We studied Texas history until we got to junior high before we started studying American history very much. And it's high school really before we got civics and American history. It's a big course, but we always had Texas history from first grade on. When I was a child, I was a 5th generation Texan on one side and a 6th generation Texan on the other side. And then when I married into Jack's family, I found out that his family is mentioned in this book as having had a large place where they could stop overnight on their way to San Antonio from another settled area. So that was part of the Lawrence family there. He was also kin to the Georges who had come down from North Carolina, and that's, I have Georges on my side of the family. So the first year we were married, we went to a reunion of my side of the family, my grandparents, and sure enough, the Georges on that side kept singing, "Why is your middle name Jack George Lawrence? Why is your middle name George?" And they kept saying, well, they came from what part of North Carolina. They finally settled down that they were distant cousins. So I did marry a fourth or fifth removed cousin. And that's not unusual considering the fact that we're fifth and sixth generations Texans, because we came in with Stephen F. Austin's colonists. That's how my forebears came to Texas. They came with the colonists. My best friend when I was in high school was Jane Nimitz. And all of you know that Admiral Nimitz came from Fredericksburg. And her forebears came in with the German immigrants who were brought in straight from Germany and brought down to Fredericksburg into the hill country, the New Braunfels area. And so she very well steeped in that. We used to get to talk about the fact that we were full-fledged Texans because Jill, when I was in the third grade before they adopted a state song, and no one but state-bred children could sing that song, you know. So there wasn't anybody in my room that wasn't in the state. Out in San Angelo, so, but that was the first rendition of it when it was just the people that had been born in the state could sing that state song. Have you learned that song yet? It's called Texas, Our Texas. It was written by a woman who lives right outside of Hamlin. That's where my sister lives now. And I have one of the original copies of the manuscript. And so you see our family has just been going around Texas for a while. As the families increased, they kept spreading out. But to get back to my story, we have a colonist and we have them coming, and they've gotten down, they're coming all ways. They're coming down the river, out the Allegheny River into the Mississippi River. They're coming down on boats, and those areas go to Matagorda, everything. There's two settlements. Stephen F. Austin brings in many people who can, what do they do when they measure the land? Surveyors. He brought in many surveyors. One of our stories in this book is connected with a surveyor who went back to his home city of New York City and married and brought his bride back to Texas. He had been on the survey team for Stephen F. Austin. Now they were, according to what colonists came in, because at the same time the Austin colonists came in, they had 4 other colonists being organized and being put into different areas of Texas. But we're concerned mainly with the 2 that Stephen F. Austin founded. Now there wasn't any highways coming into Texas. There were roads systems down in South and Middle Texas in the hill country because the Spaniards had been there long enough that they had a direct route up from Mexico City and to the coast. But the way that most of these people came in, they came in across Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and down into Texas, right through this area. They didn't load up great big wagons like we see in all the westerns and put all their food and their feather beds and their furniture and their clocks and carry their supplies and comfort and bivouac at night in a circle to protect themselves and their livestock and put their livestock in the center and build their cook fires. These people that I'm talking about had to come in on horseback. And this included the women. And they had to bring all their possessions on horseback. Now this book is called Texas Tears and Texas Sunshine. And these were 2 of the favorite quilts that the women quilted. If they quilted a quilt in bright colors and everything, it was their Texas Sunshine quilts, and that meant good days, and they'd get out the light quilt when it wasn't raining, you know, the light colored one. But if it was a Texas Tears day when it was showering and storming and everything, then the darker quilts came out. And they were made out of their old clothes. Now, they didn't have just a lot of old clothes. What did they do for clothes when they came? Pat has a spinning wheel over there. She has carding that shows you how to card the wool. But they couldn't always find wool. what did they use? They used rabbit hair. And they used coyote fur. And they used wolf fur. And they used horse hair. They used a lot of things. They pull all the poor tails with horses and the manes out to make threads. They had to have some kind of thread to use to spin on their spinning wheels. In fact, they had to make their own spinning wheels. They couldn't afford to bring them in on horseback, so once they got to where they were, the very first thing that they looked for, they always tried to have a carpenter, one that was well skilled in all, that had to build their own house, had to build their own furniture. They had to build everything they used because there wasn't a corner drugstore to run to or a grocery store. And the wife, it was a very stressful time for him because the husband had to shoot enough game to keep him from going hungry because he hadn't yet had time to farm anywhere. They found wild berries only in season. They didn't have a store that shipped them in from out of state where they were growing somewhere else. They find an occasional honey bee hive or wild grapes in season, or the wild little peaches, and we used to call them Indian peaches, and the reason why is they're little wild peach trees like little wild plum trees, and they have a big seed and very little fruit around them, but they're very good, and they learn to use them, and they learn to use those wild onions I'm trying to constantly uproot out of my front yard as seasoning, and they would gather all kinds of greens, and for those of you who are not familiar with poke salad, that's a wild green that the Indians had learned to use, and they used it. I have some growing in my yard right now that I'm not going to bother to cook, but I have cooked some, and I can say I've eaten poke salad. Of course, they were, yes, Jill?
Did they bring livestock with them?
I'm going to tell you about one of the first stories in here is about Mary Crownover Rabb. And Mary Crownover Rabb was one of the original Stephen F. Austin 300 colonists. And her family had decided that they wanted to come down to Texas, her mother and father. And she was a young lady. And they got to Arkansas. And they rested. And I heard a lady in the Queen of Pittsburgh tell about when her family was coming in and she was a child, and she can remember stopping at a wagon there, tenting ground that furnished them a roof over their head and a place to cook and rest, kind of like a motel. And she stopped at this where they could feed their horses and rest for a few days before they went on. They could be under a roof and get their clothes washed up and everything. But they didn't have those in those first days. There wasn't anything. And so Mary Crownover got to Arkansas and fell in love with an Arkansan. Very young and vigorous. His name was Rabb, and she was real fond of him. Her mother and father went on into Texas to get their land because they, under Stephen F. Austin's original 300 colonists, they were allowed a labor of land. Now, you all ask me what a labor of land is. Before the surveyor could come in, a labor of land was just as much land from daybreak to dark as a man could drive a plow around and plow an area. He got a labor. That was a day's labor of land. And each family was allowed so many labors of land. Or there was a league of land, which roughly is about half of an acre, about 300 and some acres. Half of is about, let's see, an acre is 625 miles, something like that. And it's about 300 miles. But a league and a labor are just about synonymous. It depended upon the settlers that came in. And she fell in love with John Rabb and married him and became pregnant. Her mother and father and her brothers and sisters and her uncles and aunts went on without. But they had made plans that when she could travel, they would all join up together. And so she started out to Texas aboard a big gray horse, and this big gray horse is the crux of their whole journey. Now, I have a photograph from the University of Texas of the Rabbs when they were older, and it tells a story in her own words. I mean, she's clarified it a little bit, but it starts off with her journal, and she tells about, I left Jonesboro, Red River, Miller County, Arkansas, with my husband, John Rabb, and my little babe to come to Texas. We started October the 1st, 1823. Also along with them was Mr. Rabb's father and Andrew Rabb and Thomas Rabb. They're kinfolk, but she doesn't identify them. Mr. Rabb also had a sister with her husband, and Mr. Newman, and her children. And Mr. Newman's children's names were Polly, William, Eliza, Minerva, Sarah, Thomas, and Eli. Already big family. All came to Texas at the same time, and every family had a few cattle. And you asked about cattle, all right? Every family had a few cattle. She had a big, large iron gray horse, and his name was Tarmanner. And in order to make it more comfortable for her, no wagon, and they were driving horses, so you can realize that they only made 8 to 10 miles a day at the best, on the good days. When it was raining and stormy and it was cold, they didn't start till October the 1st, and they were coming in across Red River, and they were coming on down through East Texas, and you realize how cold it gets in October, November, and December in this part of the country. And this is the 3 months that they were traveling. And she used a Spanish pack saddle on Tarmanner. And a Spanish pack saddle is a huge thing. It's got a big horn in the front and a big horn in the back and a big wide seat. And she filled it in with her quilts that she had made. And she filled it in with the blankets. And she filled it in. She tied her skillets and things on. She had a pack horse that she led, and she tied her skillets hanging on either side of his pack saddle and that she had to cook with every day. Now, they had to carry what supplies they could carry with them. Now, talk about a man and a woman and children, and she had a baby that she had to carry in her arms. They didn't have Pampers. They didn't even have enough diapers. They didn't stop long enough to get them dry anyway. Well, what in the world could they have used? What could they have used for cleaning soap? She says she used sand to scour out her pots and pans when she got through cooking them and turn them upside down. Well, each meal she took the skirt of her riding habit, which she wore the whole 3 months, and wiped out the skillet to dry it off so that it wouldn't corrode and rust on her too much. It was going to do that anyway. Because there were a lot of times when she cooked, the only thing she had to cook were either dried rice or dried beans or something like that, because they found a rabbit or a squirrel or a turkey or some kind of bird they could have killed that day, or a deer. And at this time, there were a lot of buffalo up in northeast Texas. And when they'd find buffalo herd, they'd be real elated because they could shoot a buffalo. They're slow moving, and the men could take off on their horses. And they had to be good shots because the buffalo are very fast and tricky and they're spirited away. But occasionally they'd shoot it. But they had no refrigeration, so they had to cook whatever they could cook, and they dried it. And how did they dry it? Well, they spread it from the horse's head to the horse's tail, little strips of beef, and as they went along, the flies gathered and the mosquitoes and the gnats followed them along until that meat was completely dried up. And then it was called dried beef jerky. And the reason they called it beef jerky is that when they had jerked it off that wire, they'd have to really jerk it to try to tenderize it enough to be able to chew it. Now, this all sounds very romantic, but it was not romantic at all, because they camped out under the stars each night, and that was just fine as long as the weather held up and it was beautiful. But what happened when they were having one of these thunderstorms that comes through here? Oh, one of those blue northers that comes down across Oklahoma and comes into North Texas. The only shelter they had was to take her quilts and spread them between trees or over bushes and crawl in under them and try to stay as dry as they could under those quilts. They didn't have tents, they didn't have tarps, they only had the quilts. She doesn't talk about taking her feather pillows. Some other women do. They talk about having their feather pillows. Now, while she was coming in that way, there were women that were coming in luxury even. They were coming down the steamships, coming down the Mississippi. And they were coming in boats around Florida Keys, coming that way into the Gulf. And they were all heading for Matagorda, because Matagorda was already a Spanish town, and it was well inhabited, and the Indians were friendly in that area. So there were more people going into this area at that particular time, the second settlement, than there were at the first. When they finally, after 3 months, had gotten to where her folks already were, their cows, who were mostly young cows, had started getting sick, Jill. And they'd gotten so sick that they had to leave one of the uncles and his son there to get the cows well enough to continue on. And if you've ever walked behind cows very much, you know they have very soft hoofs, so their hoofs were splaying out, and they were having lots of trouble. And they lost a lot of the cows. Their milk cow didn't make it with them, and she didn't have to worry about having any pablum or anything for her baby because she had fed her baby, because the cows weren't giving any milk because they were being pushed so hard every day that they just stopped giving milk. So now they don't have any milk, they're running out of flour, and they're running out of cornmeal when they finally get down to San Felipe and get into where the rest of the family are. And they have already built a log cabin, but it's not big enough for them, so in less than a week's time, her husband and the other rats had built a house, a log cabin. And they'd caulked it inside with cow dung and grass, and doesn't that sound good? And mud, and in the springtime all that sprouted, and they had little weeds coming down the walls and under the houses. They didn't have a very strong roof. They had a strong roof, but it didn't keep it from leaking. And many a night she said she had to spread those trusty quilts up over her children's head to keep them from getting so wet. And after a while, those quilts would get soggy, and down they'd crash on top of the people that were trying to sleep underneath them. This was a hard, hard life. And at first they built their houses near the Colorado River because they wanted to be near water, so they could have water to wash with, water to bathe with. Now, there wasn't such a thing all the way they were traveling. She never changed clothes. Her husband never changed clothes. They never stopped to wash their clothes because they were trying to beat this deadline and get in there before the snow came. So they were, you can imagine, that whenever they had to take a bath, they had to take it in a cold stream. And they didn't have any towels to dry off on. We said if the sunshine wasn't out and they had to wash their hair, then they just washed it and hung real nice and damp around them. The flies and the mosquitoes bothered them terribly in the river bottom. And they finally had to move out of the river bottom about 4 miles up on a hill to get away from all the mosquitoes. And that meant that every day their husbands had to leave them, the men had to leave them, and go tend to the fields of cotton that they planted, and leave them at the prey of all the Indians that came through. Mary talks about one night, after they'd lost all their horses to marauding Indians, and their cows had been killed and driven off, except for the ones she kept in the house and the pigs in the house. She padlocked Tarminter to her door. Now, she uses door, but it was really a piece of wood that she could put up and down because they didn't have any hinges yet. So she propped this door in and propped it up with 2 other logs and pushed the bed up against that. And she said, but the Indians would come in and get up on the roof and holler down the chimney and try to steal Tarminter, and they couldn't because she had him chained and padlocked. And so she'd just keep her spinning wheel whizzing, she said, because she couldn't sleep because she was so miserable because the Indians were right there in her yard. One day she was out tending to her garden that she kept kind of close to the house, and she heard the next house over, which could have been 3 or 4 miles. She heard shooting and firing, and her husband came running in and said, oh, the Armstrongs have just been annihilated, they're all dead, and we're going to have to get out of here and move. So they got up in the middle of the night and left their house and moved out. And sure enough, the Indians did come in and go around and go through their house and go through their belongings. And this is kind of like those women live. Now we're going to talk about a woman, though, who didn't live that kind of life. She was a belle. She had been born in England, and she was a fancy woman, fancy parents. Her father was well educated. He was a teacher and a professor, and he had been brought to America to teach a plantation owner down in McGarda, daughter, English literature and the fine arts. And he sent for his family. And on the way over, she talks about what a wonderful time she had on the trip, on the boat coming over, and all the men who wanted to marry her, and how they loved her wardrobe and everything. And then she gets to McGarda. And at McGarda, she goes to this beautiful house. And she's so thrilled with this beautiful house because it's a mansion. It looks great. But she gets inside, and it's just a shell of a house inside. And upstairs, in this enormous bedroom area, there are 2 bedrooms that are not separated by anything, just 2 complete rooms on either side of this big flowing center stairway. And the women sleep on one side of the room, and the men sleep on the other side, so they never get completely undressed, because back in those days, it was pretty bad to see somebody in their underwear, so they just They just went to sleep in their clothes and slept across, not with any partitions of any kind from each other. But she talks about this being one of the fondest times of her life because they had big balls and big parties and big dinners and everything. And her name was Dilue, D-I-L-U-E, Dilue Rose Harris. And she was here in the time of Remember the Alamo. She was here when they were having the revolution. And she talks about how all the people, they conscripted all the people to go fight in the war, but her husband didn't want to go, so he sent his overseer, his foreman, and that young man was killed with famine. And the Brazos River plays a real important part in this. And all of you know the story of Rachel Parker Plummer. We've all heard of Quanah Parker. We've all heard of the Parkers that were stolen away from the fort. Well, this was down even in the hill country, and the Indians were so bad there that the people could not have their houses outside of their own individual forts. And while they lived at Fort Parker, it was not a military fort. You'll have to understand this was a fort of family, a family fort, that they had built their own stockades around and everything. But the Indians came one time and killed nearly all the men and took 3 children, 4 women into captivity. And Rachel Parker Plummer was one of them. She was a young mother, and she had a 2-year-old. And they took them into captivity and marched them off. And she said that they beat her little 2-year-old baby with the strings on their bows until when he'd cry. And of course, that'd make him cry even more, wouldn't it? But he'd cry, and they wouldn't let him nurse. And he finally died. She doesn't know what happened to that baby. But she had another baby. She had an Indian baby. And that Indian baby became Quanah Parker, great Indian chief, and was half white, half Indian. And it was a terrible time of massacre. And in this book there are many stories. The Mavericks play an important part. You know, we've heard of Sam Maverick. There's been a Sam Maverick in Texas ever since 1828, and there's still Sam Maverick today. This is a Maverick family, and they came from South Carolina. They immigrated to Texas in 1835. And then they talk about how the Rangers, a woman who married a Texas Ranger, and she went with him out into the part of the country I came from. They were stationed at Brady, which is about 65 miles from San Angelo, where I grew up. And they were stationed there, and she lived in a fence stockade made out of mesquite wood, and that's the only kind of wood they have in that area. It's mesquite trees, and so in order to make their stockade tall enough to be any protection at all, they put all the mesquite limbs on the outside and kept building it up that way until there's a picture in here, and it's a very fascinating picture of how she lived in this stockade, and she cooked for the Rangers when they were out tracking the Indians, because they were getting ready then, before the Civil War, to make a series of forts down through north, central, east Texas, western part of Texas, where the Comanches and the Apaches made their raids down into Mexico. Well, we've gotten them through the Revolution. They won. They had to leave their homes. When the Mexicans came up, they had to get out ahead of them, and they called it the Great Stampede because they were all trying to get out ahead of the Mexicans, and then they went back. And some of them never did get their places back because they'd been burned to the ground. They had to start completely over again. And they started over again, and then they had just gotten into a flush of kind of prosperity. They were getting their rice was doing well, their cotton was doing beautifully, they were flourishing, they were having towns of their own. And the people that lived in San Antonio were feeling like, well, things are getting pretty civilized here. And this young woman comes to San Antonio to meet her fiancé, to be married, and she's staying right downtown near the river where we have big hotels today. And all of a sudden, the Indians just swept through the middle of town, up and down the streets and into the houses, and killed the people next door to her. And there they had this big Indian raid right in the middle of San Antonio. So see, it still hadn't gotten real civilized by that time. But then the Civil War comes along, and Texas is divided. And one of my grandfathers fought for the Confederacy, and one of my grandfathers fought for the Union. And they lived across the street from each other in Frost, Texas, Lone Star community. And they never spoke. And when I was a child and I went to see my great-grandfather's that each tell me stories about the other. But they never talked, and they lived, their houses were like this library and one of those trailer courts over there, that far apart. And they never had spoken, and yet their daughters and sons had intermarried each other. And my grandfather, he had married a sister that his brother had married a sister out of his family, these opposing, and they tried to settle the question, but it was very hard. You didn't get to see both your grandparents at the same time, your great-grandparents. The Civil War still holds on. When Gone with the Wind came out, and I can remember sitting in Texas Theater in San Angelo seeing Gone with the Wind, and when it came to where, just before intermission, and they quit and said, "The South made a magnificent victory," everybody stood up and cheered, including me. Because I had heard these stories about Civil War all my life, and how terrible it was, and what had happened to the people, how they'd lost their land, and how it had been confiscated. But Texas came through that all right. This book ends up telling about very prosperous cotton farmers that went to around Vernon, Chillicothe, Quanah, up in that area, Lubbock area, and how they dry farmed cotton. They'd never dry farmed before, but that's where their land was, and that's where they dry farmed cotton. And this is a picture of a family that is talked about in this book, picking their cotton. Have you ever seen people pick cotton? Well, people don't pick cotton much anymore. They have these old cotton picking machines. But when I was a little girl, and my Uncle George, Jack George Lawrence, and my Uncle George Green had land, and my Uncle Marion had land where they grew cotton. And because I was visiting, they gave me a cotton sack, a child's cotton sack. They had children's sacks, women's sacks, and men's sacks, and nigger sacks. They were the largest. Children's sacks were small, and my uncle told me if I could fill it, he'd give me a dime. Took me all day. All day. Meanwhile, my cousin Morris had filled 4 or 5, and he didn't get a dime. He didn't get anything. But when I finally bought mine in, sunburned and blistered, I got a whole dime for it. Took a lot of cotton balls to put in that, fill up one of those little tiny sacks like that little boy's wagon right there. This book is real interesting, and I'm sorry that I can't get around to it, but the mainstay of the whole story is that the women had to make their own clothes and their men's clothes, and they didn't have sewing machines, and they didn't have material that they could go buy anywhere. And how did they do it? They made it out of the first cotton crops they got. They got their cotton, they got their wool, they traded back and forth with Indians, they got buffalo hides, you talked about yak a while ago, same difference. The buffalo fur made great thread too. Their cattle, as I said, and horses had no manes or tails because there were times when they didn't have anything to make thread out of but those things. They learned to keep, didn't have bobby pins for their hair, they didn't have hairpins. They had to use leather thongs to tie their hair up. They used grease from the animals as cold cream and hand lotion. And for soap, there was a root of a limestone root, a little bush, called it limestone bush, and if you boil that down, it frogged up and made sort of a settlement in the bottom where they could have soap of sort to do their clothes on. Mostly, they'd go down to the bank of a river and they'd get a big boulder, and they'd wet their clothes down and slap it against that boulder in lieu of having a washboard. And they'd wind it and slap it against the boulder. And the clothes had to be hardy to survive washings. They didn't wash them often, though. And I have to repeat, they didn't bathe often, and they didn't wash often. In fact, one of the stories, not in this book, one of the stories I read in the accompanying book said that the baby was 14 months old before it had a full bath. And we just can't feature that. I imagine the baby was full of cradle crap. Excuse me. That's what I was thinking about. Well, what am I trying to say? Cradle cap. and full of insect bites. They talked about picking the fleas and the ticks off their babies, like they did the dogs. And the babies slept with the dogs for warmth, because it would be, when the Indians were so bad, the pigs and the chickens and everything came in the house with them, and even if they just had one room to keep them from, the Indians from taking them. And they all slept in the house together. And so they had some terrible times, and yet when they got to be old women and they were writing their memoirs and writing their journals, they talked about this being the happiest time of their life. And why was it the happiest time? Because they had been fulfilled. They had accomplished. They had really done something. From the sweat of their brow and the labor of their hands, they had made a home, and they had kept their children and their husbands clothed, and they had fed them. Where they died off of fever. They died off of a lot of things. The women learned from the Indians there were certain roots they could use. They didn't have aspirin pills. They didn't have a doctor close by. They didn't have anybody that they could turn to. When their child got fever, the only thing they knew to it was to bathe it with water, cold water, and they just didn't know anything to do for it. That one of the only thing they could really remember was, do we feed a fever or do we starve a cold? You know, they tried to remember the things that they had learned as children, but they were children themselves when they came here. They were very young people. And they hadn't lived with their folks long enough, and they hadn't had the experience long enough to know what to do for each other. And yet they did it. They survived, and they reared their children, and they established a land. And any of us who have parents and ancestors who have done this ought to have a very grateful feeling, because they really went through a hardship to have us. And Pat has this way of showing you how they made their material for their quilts. When they didn't have old clothes to cut up to make their quilts, they had to make their thread. Then they had to weave their thread. Then they had, after they wove their thread, then they had to knit it, crochet it, or make it into cloth. And then they had looms that they put, and Pat has a loom with her tonight. She's going to show you how you make wool material. Now, they made cotton material. The Irish immigrants that came over wanted to grow flax so they could have linen, because they could have flax seeds that they brought with them. Texas was not real conducive to flax seeds. It took a different kind of climate. It took one that's kind of misty, moisty like Ireland is to grow good flax, and flax never did do real good here. And so they adapted a cotton that was the greatest cotton that had ever, they hybrid it, they got it to where it went with the Nile cotton, because at that time, cotton that was grown in the Nile Valley was the best cotton. But then it got to where Texas had the best cotton, and they learned to take the Mexican Angora goats and bring them up instead of the sheep, because the goats could survive where sheep could not. And so they brought the Angora goats in, and they had beautiful wool to knit out of for the Angora goats. But this took time. It took time to grow their first food. It took time to get their crops together. They traded back and forth to have pigs and chickens. And when they'd move somewhere, they'd sling the chickens upside down. And if you've ever carried a chicken upside down, you know it seeps. It just, all the body liquids kind of flow out of a chicken when it's upside down. I don't know how long they'd carry them, but Mary Rabb carried one for 4 days, a pair of them slung across her saddle bags, and expected them to have eggs at the end of the time. This is a book that you. It's all written down from journals. It's factual. It's there. And it's about women. And somewhere in there you might find somebody that has your name. I'll look to see if this is not talking about this area. The closest it gets to us is down where my great-great-great-grandparents came from. And that was down in the area that's below Blooming Grove and Waxahachie now, down in that area. And that's as close as it got here. But the fact remains that most of those people came down through this area and didn't think enough of it to stop until the Pitts came along. And the Pitts were bound for that area too, and they got tired traveling. And that's why we have Pittsburgh, is because they finally decided they had come far enough. They were never going to meet up with the rest of the people that had gone ahead of them, and they were just going to stop right here. And that's how the Pitts stopped here. I want to thank you all for listening. So, do you have any questions? Jill, do you have any questions?
You ever heard of Jane Long?
I've heard of Jane Long. I know who Jane Long was. Jane Long is in this book. So, Jane Long. Jill, would you tell, have you heard of Jane Long, Josie? Do you remember studying about Jane Long? Yeah. Jill, would you tell the folks here who Jane Long is?
She followed her husband around all through Texas. And
she did that?
Finally, he left and went somewhere, and he was gone for years. And she finally found out he was dead, and the Indians kept attacking him. I think she was the first citizen of Texas.
That's right. That, she has the distinction of being the first citizen of Texas. And her husband was gone because he had gone off to try to find the Indians that had taken their horses. And he just never did come back again. So evidently the Indians found him.
Virginia, are there any books that deal with the settlement of, not necessarily Pittsburgh, but of the East Texas area?
Yes, there are some books that deal with this area. In fact, Linda, your dad has written a book called Cherokee Trace. We have
Love is a Wild Assault.
Love is a Wild Assault was written by some Gilmer from
No,
Dangerfield.
Jefferson.
Well, I went when she was here.
No.
When she was here, I talked to her at great length and couldn't remember. In fact, she's written 3 novels now, and it's all settled in this area. But for factual, hers are really not factual. Hers are fictitious, but they do talk about the times in this area. Then, when I first moved here, there was a woman named Artie Spencer. Now I have heard pros and cons about Artie Spencer and about her fact, what she could remember was not the way that the different families she wrote about actually were. But we have a book here in this library written by Artie that takes up the families here. Have you ever read that? We have 2 books. She wrote 2 books, and I think this is why the genealogy department was so interested in compiling a book of the families, because that book that we have here for sale in this library tells about the families and how they got here and who all came with them and the groups, their family groups as well as they can remember. So it's real interesting. I grew up around the Fort Concho out in San Angelo, and my family was very connected with that because Tom Green County was named for the Greens, and I grew up and went to school on the parade grounds of Fort Concho, and it's one of the only forts in Texas that has 23 original buildings still standing and everything. So it's a real interesting place to have grown up and be that closely connected with. I went to the same school that my mother and my aunt went to, had the same principal, and we played on the parade ground of Fort Concho. That was our playground from our school. Our school was named Fort Concho, our grade school. So I have, yes, no, but
About what date did that book start? And about
this
when-
book
what
started,
date?
this book started in 1819. The first story starts about when they got to Texas on October the 1st, 1823. But back here in the back, it starts talking about people back in 1815, 1814, and when they come to Texas to survey it first. See, they had to come down and survey it, because then the Mexican government had to approve of it. And then they had to decide how many they could bring in. And that first settlement, Stephen F. Austin could bring 400. And then the German government had made a contract with Mexico, and they paid them by the head. So they let so many come in, and then each one of the colonists they had to pay for each one of them to come in, their land tax. And it's real interesting how they got their land. And some of the biggest areas around here, like that XYZ ranch up in the Panhandle, why it's so big is there were 7 brothers that came in, and they each got their 7 birthrights, land rights, all in a big jug. And then as people got discouraged and moved away, they bought up the fringe area, and they just kept adding to it till they got acre upon acre upon acre of ground up there. And it's still a big holding. And King Ranch was done the same way. They got an original holding, and then by hook and crook, they procured more and more land until it wasn't always legal and above board. There were a lot of shootings and people that disappeared, and their land was taken over. And I had a great-great-uncle who was a nester. You know what a nester is? Well, nesters are a little bit different from settlers because nesters came in when they weren't supposed to come in. And nesters came in, and they needed some land too. And they'd go out somewhere where nobody was settling, and they'd just set up camp. They'd build a cabin and they'd nest. They'd build themselves a little nest, and they were called nesters. Now that was a nice kind of word to talk about them. because they were settling on other people's land that they had already got land grants for down in Austin. And while they never did see that land, eventually they heard about all these nesters that were gathering in the bend of a particular river somewhere, and they'd come and drive them out, and they'd have range wars. And when the sheep came to Texas for the cattlemen were, well, they had more range wars. Texas had, in 170 years, has had a lot of problems with each other, with the Mexicans, with the Indians. So if you would like to see how they spun, it's ready.
The right direction. But you have to put it on there, and then you take the other one and you just comb it like you would comb your hair, get the knots and the burrs and that sort of thing, and then you have to kind of flip it over and do it again until you've worked all the stuff out. And then once you have that done, and then see you spin from this. This makes what that is actually. And then you take it after you had carded all the wool, and it took hours and hours and hours to do that. Then they would sit and spin it. And spinning is really not all that hard. It's like swimming. You can't do it, and you can't do it, and you can't do it, and then all of a sudden you can do it. And I don't know what, you just have to practice it. There's kind of a feel for it. This wheel, incidentally, is not an old wheel. It's a New Zealand wheel that I bought as a kit and put together. But wool has, it's like human hair. It has little scales on it. If you look at it under a microscope, and you can see that it just kind of lines into yarn very easily. And when you slow it down and let it go through see how you can thicken it or make it very thin. Now when you spin, this is a single ply yarn because it's just one thread. To make it stronger so they could knit it, they'd take it and they would take 2 spools full like this and put it on a little gizmo called a lazy cake, a little device, and I'm going to show you what a lazy cake looks like. But you see how it just kind of almost does itself? If you get it going just right, it'll just pull itself out. You can do it one-handed. They used to have to do it one-handed. Most of the wheels that you see around here are called walking wheels. They're the huge, tall ones. You couldn't sit down and spin on those. You had to stand up. And you had to turn the wheel instead of having a treadle on it.
That's right.
You had to turn it with one hand and hold the thread with the other, so you didn't have the luxury of being able to control it with both hands. So you had to get real good at judging how fast to pull it. If you break
And they whistled, and the reason they whistled is because they weren't made as nicely as these, you know.
You just stick it back on there and it'll mend. Now, once you get a spoolful of this, you put it on, or 2 of them, you put it on this little thing, and this is called a lazy Kate. Don't ask me why. And you ply it. You have a spool here and a spool here, and you spin it backwards, and it twists on itself. And those of you who knit know what I mean. It's a double thread. Let me show you. This has been plied, and it's 2 of these threads spun together, so it's very much thicker and it's heavier, and it'll last longer. It won't pull apart so easily when you try to knit it. Then after you got it on this, after you had it, well, you spin it actually on one of these things, ply it onto a spool. Then you have to put it on this little thing, which is called a niddy noddy, and it measures it out. Once around this thing is a yard, all the way around it. So they could count how many yards you needed so many yards to make a sweater. Well, you could count how many yards you had. You just counted your threads and multiplied by yards. And then, once you get it to this point, you have to be sure that it doesn't come unspun on you. So, now all this has to be done with all this whole sheet full of wool, remember. You make it into what's called a skein, like this. And you wet this and hang a weight on it and tie little pieces of wool around it to keep it all straight so it doesn't get all bunched up. Hang a weight on it, wet it real good, and hang it so that it'll stretch and set the spin. And it won't come unspun after you've wet it and let it sit. When you do this, then they would twist it. You've seen skeins done this way. They would just twist it up and stick one end through the other one, and that's the way you store it. It just kind of spins around on itself. When you have done that, you can buy a little, you put it on, and I guess, let me just scoot this table out so you can see what I'm doing here. You take that, once it's all set in a skein like that, and put it on this thing, which is called an umbrella sweat. Now these things are made, whoops, it's not gonna, doesn't want to stay on there. I'm looking for the end of it so you can see how they wound balls of yarn. I know it's on here somewhere. Anyway, it's hard to knit from something like this, as you might well imagine. So this little thing over here to my left is a ball winder, a wool winder. This, naturally, it's going to be bulky here around the end. But what you do is take this and run it through here, and this winds your ball of yarn, and to keep it from getting stuck, as it winds, this thing will spin.
Isn't that nice? I used to have to do my hands
Yeah,
this
you've
way
seen people
for my
do
grandmother,
their
and
hands.
she did it
This
making
is to
it.
keep you from having to do that.
She said you're letting it get too lax,
Yes,
that's too tight.
You'd have to hold it so somebody could wind the balls of yarn. Well, now we don't have to do that. We have a wool winder. And it makes a little neat ball like this that is it just pulls right out. Like the kind you buy at the store. It's a self-feeding little ball of yarn, and you can just knit all you want to. It pulls right out the top, see? Okay. Then once you got this thread, you were only half there. You had to, usually they didn't use lap looms, they used floor looms, but I don't happen to have one of those. And they would take this yarn, this happens to be hand spun, some hand spun yarn, and they would warp a loom, and that's running these threads this way. Once you have the loom warped, the little thing right here is called a heddle. Now most of you have done weaving. I've got it upside down, helps if you hold it right. You push these little things on the edge of a table or a wagon bed or anything you happen to have to push it on, and you lift this up, and when you do, supposedly, let me show you what it does. The ones you have probably done have been, well, it's too loose. You have to do this way to weave, push it in and out.
With a shuttle.
Yeah. This little gizmo, when somebody finally figured out how to do this, it got real easy. Because this little heddle pulls up, if you push it down, see it raises one set of threads. And when you pull it up, it raises the opposite set of threads. So all you have to do is push your shuttle through. You don't have to do the up and down motion. You just push it through. Like that. And then when you get that one done, you push it down, and it brings up the other set of threads. And so you push it through that way instead of having to weave up and down. So then when you got all this done, see, and it made rather woolly, rough cloth. One of my favorite things, I didn't realize what this meant, but I was teaching ballads, old English ballads, to my class one semester after I had taken this class. And they were fond of writing ballads about stories about rich people because the poor people didn't have very much. And one of the things they said about one of the heroines in those ballads was that she had a cloak of smooth cloth. And I used to wonder, why in the world would they make such a deal out of smooth cloth? Well, if you've ever seen hand-spun, hand-woven, itchy fabric, you'd know why they made such a deal. This is about as fine as it gets. And if you have to wear this next to your skin, it's quite harsh.
But you know, they make such a deal in the Bible about Jesus' no-seam
Yes.
robe and smooth robe, because this is probably the most expensive article
Oh, it was difficult to get,
that
yes.
he ever owned, of wearing apparel that he ever owned. And you know, they threw dice for him at the foot of the cloth, at the foot of the cross for that cloak, because those soldiers had never seen such fine material.
And you're limited, of course, to the width of the loom you've got. You can't weave anything in it unless you want to put a seam in it. If you have an 8-foot wide loom, you can weave an 8-foot wide piece of material, but if you have I think this is a 24-inch loom, you weave a 24-inch swath of material. Now, you'd be surprised what you can do with this. Now, if they wanted pretty colors, let me show you what they did to get the pretty colors. That little thing is called a shuttle. Excuse me. Turn it off. She said, what? But anyway, the kinds you do with fabrics, you would be amazed what you can do with a little piece of wool and some of the most bizarre things you can imagine. For example, you know the old curly dock that grows out in the middle of people's pastures? Well, the Indians and the pioneers made dye out of curly dock. And these are little swatches of yarn that have been dyed with curly dock. Now, what you do, it depended on what kind of pot you boiled your dye in, what color it turned. If you boiled it in a copper pot, it turned one color. Let me see what happened here. This is dyed with copper. See this pretty dark green? And the lighter green is just not, this was picked 6 weeks later than this was. So it's got more chlorophyll in it and it's greener dye. This was dyed with an aluminum, what's called a mordant. If you dyed it in an aluminum pot, it would turn yellow. If you dyed it in a, what else did they do? Tin, it would turn a darker color, like the brown on the bottom right. These, I'm going to save this till last because this is the best one. You can buy a dye that's made from a logwood, it's called, and it gives you a real nice gray color. You can buy logwood. I guess it grows around here someplace. They used to call it logwood. I have no idea what the name of it is. This has been dyed with what's called Brazil wood. It's a root. No, it's a bark. Brazil wood's a bark. This was dyed with yellow onion skins. The yellow on the front, on the top, is just plain old yellow onion skins. And they would boil those onion skins. And if you do it with alum or aluminum, you get the bright yellow. If you do it with copper, you get the kind of brownish color. Something about the kind of metal that you cook it in gives you different colors.
What color was it originally before you started dyeing?
White.
White.
All this was white wool. It's hard to dye though, brown. You can hardly do that. Look what happens with Osage. You can get everything ranging depending on what kind of pot you boil it in, from that beautiful blue on the top to a yellow to a green. But those of you who have ever mixed colors, what happens when you mix blue and yellow?
Green.
Yeah, you get green, don't you? So they would mix colors together. They would use walnut shells, madder root.
Pecan shells make
Pecan.
pretty rich brown.
Yes, pecan shells. But you would never guess what they used to get these lovely pinks and reds
Beets.
and purples. Hmm?
Beets.
Not beets.
Berry.
No, ma'am.
Radishes?
Bugs.
Oh my
There is a little bug called a cochineal bug that lives on prickly pear cactuses.
Yeah, it looks like a little weevil.
A little weevil. That's exactly right. When you boil those little bugs, now whoever figured this one out, I don't know. When you boil those little bugs, they give you the most beautiful red yarns.
Well, I
Like
didn't know they
this.
were worth anything.
See this? Now, you go pick all those little bugs off your prickly pears, Virginia, and
No,
you
they
can
just
dye.
go into the quilt with you.
You can get every color under the sun with that. Any shades of purple or peaches or
I wish I'd
beautiful
known that.
magentas and reds. Huh?
I wish I'd known that.
Yeah. Do you know that they even sell dried cochineal bugs? You can buy them in a little package at some of the supply houses that sell supplies for people who spin and dye. Now, there's one bad thing about this.
Smell.
The smell is awful, and you have to have a whole set of pots and utensils that you dye things with, because you cannot use, instead of using the copper and tin and aluminum pots, what people do is just buy the salts forms of these metal salts, and they're highly toxic. So anything that you use to dye your yarn in, you can't use to cook in. So you have to have a whole set of separate utensils, big ones, obviously, because if you had, why can't you dye these things one at a time?
Because they never come out the same color.
Won't come out the same color. That's what they mean by the
Dye
dye
lots.
lots on
They
on
can't
the
even do
yarn
it
that you
commercially.
buy.
They can't do it commercially.
Can't do it commercially. If you dip one of your little skeins of yarn in it, when it's this color, you won't get that again when you put another one in. So you've got to stick them all in there at once and pull them all out at the same time to get them all the same color. So they were very, as Virginia says,
Smelly.
and but they were so innovative about the sorts of things that they would go out and pick. There is a plant that grows around Austin that has a bright red root on it.
That's what I thought.
Madder root.
Mandrake.
Yes, and it makes a pretty orange dye, almost.
You've got
Well,
something.
this I haven't got a madder root that's really a pretty color. But this is
Well, you know, they
a
have
pretty
rose
orange.
madder, oil paint, rose,
Uh-huh.
and it's made from that
Madder
madder.
root.
Mhm.
I wonder about, are any of you into this sort of thing? We dug up some old Nandina bushes in front of our
Well,
Have a book.
house. Wonderful. We have a book
We
about
have a
it.
book that has natural dyes.
Isn't that neat? But you'd be amazed what you can dye things from. Pokeberries are dyed. You can dye with pokeberries.
Lingonberries dye beautiful
Mhm.
blue.
Mhm.
So blueberries.
Coffee and tea.
Coffee and tea. They would dye that beautiful antique looking lace with coffee and tea.
During World War II, we dyed our old hose that had been washed so often that the dye came out. We dyed them in coffee and tea. You all remember that?
I
When we had
do.
hose?
I do.
We used lake dye too, because
Uh-huh.
we didn't have hose. Lake coloring.
I've done that too.
Well, anyway, yeah, you get real inventive.
You get
when
real inventive when you
You
don't
sure
have
do.
it.
Now, if you had to go through this, every time you wanted somebody a new sweater or a pair of socks or a
Mittens.
shirt, you got really good at mending things. This was not a throwaway society, and people would sit and darn socks till their fingers fell off practically, but it was a lot easier to darn a pair than it was to go through all these steps to make a pair.
And that's why children wore hand-me-down
Oh,
clothes, because they were just
for
worn out.
years.
How long a life garment are you talking
Oh,
about?
these things will wear forever. They never wear out. I'd say a good, well, I have a book that has a woman modeling a slip, and it's ugly, really ugly, that her grandmother had woven and worn practically every day of her life, and the woman was wearing it, and it was still in one piece and looked like you could wash it on a washboard and still come out with an intact garment. But they made them to last. They had to. There was no way to do anything else.
And they learned how to take bone and make buttons because they didn't have buttons.
That's right.
And they used sinew and bones for needles because they didn't have steel needles. They used bone needles.
So the next time you buy a pair of pink socks, you can think about what somebody had to go through to get pink socks, picking bugs off cactus plants. Was not what I would imagine would be a whole lot of
And you
fun.
wore them more than one season.
Yes, you wore them till they just, well, you could wear them a long time, and people had,
usually, I was reading this someplace, one set of Sunday clothes and one set of work clothes.
And two sets of underwear, one Sunday
Yeah,
and
one
every day.
Sunday and one every day. Well, you wore your work clothes all week long and slept in them. Most people did. Some people did. Especially if you were out in the middle of the desert or prairie, you couldn't change into your nightie. So you slept in your clothes. And then on Sunday, Saturday night, everybody got in and took a bath and put their Sunday clothes on, which you never washed. They just wore those clothes till they fell
I have
apart.
a picture of my mother when she went off to college at Abilene Christian College, and she's all dressed up so beautifully, but her dress is a million wrinkles. It was silk, but it was just wrinkled because she packed in a trunk, and when she got, I guess they never did take an iron with them. They used sad irons in those days anyway. But that's not what you all call them in East Texas. You don't call them sad irons. What do you call them? Flat irons?
We
Flat
did
irons.
call
Flat
it
irons.
Flat irons.
Yeah.
We called ours sad irons because ironing day was so sad.
Oh, sad. We call them flat. Yeah. Well, I agree it was sad.
But this cloth that they made was very durable and sturdy, but it was, you had to be thick-skinned. I'm sure anybody with a wool allergy just had to scratch or go without.
Well,
And
Mary Rabb wore a riding suit, a skirt, for the 3 months. She never had it off. She slept in it and everything.
Oh,
Well, you
sure.
wasn't baby walking, did you have thick skin? I'm
Yeah.
sure.
I was told by one of the high point of my life was about, I don't know, I guess 7 years ago. I went to England after saving my whole life, and we went to Stratford, and we were taken out to the Arden Farm, which is where Shakespeare's mother was born. And the guide was telling us the custom was that we get spring cleaning because they cleaned their houses once a year.
Mm-hmm.
Once. In the middle of the cleaning, between cleaning seasons, they would throw rushes on the floor, just these rush pads, over the dirt and the chicken bones and everything else. And they'd pile up sometimes 6 inches high. And that's what you get thresholds for. They would put little thresholds across the door to hold the threshes in the kitchen, keep them from spilling over into the other rooms. And then they would take all that, and when they got dirty and smelly, they'd just sprinkle a few herbs and rose petals around and throw new ones down on top of the dirty ones. And in the spring, they'd haul all this stuff outside and start over with new ones. And that's when everybody took a bath. And that's why, according to the guide I had, there were so many, that's why everybody got married in June. Because
they were
would
clean
take a
then.
bath.
They were clean then.
That's the only time anybody can stand to get close enough to have any kind of party, so that everybody would get married in June, and then they'd start the whole cycle over again.
Well, now, my great-grandmother told me about being in a sod shanty, and she had dirt floor, and she had a broom that she made out of broom weed, and she kept that dirt floor swept. That was the main thing she did every day. Keep the dust down, because if she let it get dry, she'd wet it down. Because if she let it get dry, she had dust. So they were on mud all the time. I mean, it was hard packed. but it
No,
was
no,
mud.
you can't wash the clothes and there was no way to heat the water unless you had a big pot, and so many times they couldn't.
And they couldn't.
Too cold or.
Yeah,
too
but
too
wool,
hot.
they would wash it, when they washed it, they'd wash it in cold water, you know, I can just, can't you just see our fine wool
So you
garments?
got woolite, in other words.
No, no woolite. Scrubbed it on the rug board.
I
Terrible.
got my first rubber. I never had one of
You
those.
never, like, see, she's so much younger, no, but you have to remember,
is she younger?
by the time that she came along, they had ringers and things.
I still got my first one. I wouldn't take the other.
My first job I can remember doing beside the dishes was being in the yard with a great big black iron pot, three-legged pot hang on a big fire, and I had a broom handle that I stirred the clothes in that boiling water with lye soap. And I stirred and got hot and blistered a little bit.
I've washed rubber.
And then Mother would take them and put them in a big old galvanized tub full of cold water, and that's where the rub board came in.
Well, no, Virginia, we were poor. I remember doing that as a child for my mother.
Yeah.
And the day my brother threw the cat in the wash pot. You know,
Oh,
and
sure,
scalded
that
his head.
invariably happened.
You know,
Or my sister drowned the fat hen we were gonna have the next day in a galvanized tub full of cold water waiting for the wash to come out of the pot. And she held a chicken under the water till it drowned.
Well, I've still got my water pot too. I've still got my first water pot.
Oh.
Would you like to live that way?
Doesn't sound like much fun,
I
does
don't
it, Jeff?
blame you.
We only had baths when I was a child on Saturday night, because the water had to be heated on the stove and poured into the tub, and we drew lots to see who got the first water. I didn't get it very often.
We drive in the summer out in the sun. Yeah, I mean, heated out, out in the sun.
Uh-huh.
Go in the morning,
Those
let's
are the good old days. I said, no.
Well,
These are the good days.
most of what people had here were cotton carders. These are wool carders,
Yeah,
and they
no.
would card bats for their quilts.
And then you had to get the seeds out,
Oh,
didn't you?
yeah.
Along
You
with
had
the
to
boll
pick that.
weevils and all the, and
But
the,
this
and the
would do it.
leaves and
It combs it real
the dirt.
well.
It does comb it well.
Mhm.
Cotton carders are not as fine meshed.
No,
as-
they're much
they're-
thicker.
they're
Seem
thick.
like they're narrow.
Mhm.
No.
They're narrow and they, and you slip your hands in under a strap.
Yeah.
I have carders.
Like in little
Mahatma
bats.
Gandhi believed that every person should make his own clothing, so he spun and wove all of his own clothing out of cotton. And you see, if you see this movie Gandhi, you see him sitting there with his little spinning wheel.
They had little spinning wheels.
Yeah, it's a little cotton wheel. It looks like almost like a child's
Uh-huh.
toy, one of those you crank and a little merry-go-round.
The
goes
Indians
around.
all have those kind. They still spin like that. They spin those beautiful silks that way.
Sure do. Well, I think that about covers the clothing aspect. Any questions about this? You can spin collie hair. You can
spin any kind of
cat
hair, fur.
You can spin human hair. Well, human hair doesn't do too well because it's too
Fine.
slick. It won't stick together.
I bet it did back then.
Yeah.
With the grease on there.
All the grease on it.
Mohair, as Virginia said, goat hair. They would spin rabbit hair. I saw a woman once who had made a whole shawl out of Scotty hair that she had
Gotten from her dog.
gotten from combed out of her dog.
Bob's kind of turned up. You wouldn't wear a pair of socks out of your dog hair.
I don't know
It's
how
thick.
itchy
It's-
Scotty hair off.
Animal, the only thing wrong with animal fur is that it is sticky, like dog fur and everything.
Uh-huh.
It has little wire-like
Yes, it
hairs
does.
in there. And
That's what makes it spin so easily.
Uh-huh, and it's not. I have a piece of material that was spun out of a friend's dog. She gathered up, because I get a lot of hair out of my Labrador, and it's
Uh-huh.
real nice and thick, and I think,
Yeah.
gee, this
It'll
is real
spin.
pretty fur.
You can sit with your fingers and spin the cotton out of the top of an aspirin bottle. Anything
anything.
that's fibers will spin into three.
Put that upside down.
They just stay away from
They
it
just
because it's-
darn the moth holes, I guess. That was one reason they liked flax and cotton so much, because the moths didn't get in it, obviously. And when you move into Texas, you would well know how hot wool is. You just can't wear much wool, so they started spinning cotton on those enormously tall spindles.
And theirs was standing up kind of.
Yeah, you
And
had
they
to
did
stand there and
whistle.
turn the
I
wheel
can
with one
remember
hand
my
and hold your little piece of
great-grandmother's
cotton.
wheel. It really whistled because it did, and she'd grease it every once in a while because sometimes it'd catch on fire.
This is the hard way to do it, believe me. I don't know, don't even ask me why I got interested in it. It's just that, I know how I got interested in it. I found a book in the library.
That's how you found it?
That's it. I was checking out a book and they had the new arrivals, and there was one that had the most beautiful cover on it I'd ever seen. It was skein after skein like this of hand-dyed, the most beautiful pastel shades of wool, and had spinning and weaving written across it.
And
I
that's
thought,
what,
I want to take that and see how they do that, and that led to this.
well, it's an interesting hobby to
Do you
have.
do it for therapy, for relaxation?
It's
or-
very relaxing. I don't have time to do it at all anymore. Well, I do some. I still spend. The only one who has the dubious honor of having a completely finished Pat Archer original is Jim, and he's got I spun enough wool to knit him a sweater. And I wove a scarf for a friend in Austin. But those are the only two things I've ever really finished.
I'm starting, I have enough wool almost to do me a sweater, but heaven knows when I'll ever get it finished.
What color did you dye it?
It's not dyed, it's this. This is the wool.
Oh, it's the brown.
I'm gonna do a brown one. But the dyeing is really fun, but it's very, very intricate and time consuming, and you never know what color you're gonna get. That's one thing that makes it fun. You never know what color's gonna come out.
When they got to where they had trading posts and general stores, calico was 25 cents a yard, but it took 100 pounds of cotton to trade for a yard of calico.
Couldn't afford it.
They couldn't
had to
afford it.
spend
They
their
had
own.
to spend their own cotton.
Did they have to stick the cotton together to spin it?
You do it just like.
Well,